Welcome to tonight's WWA workshop, Character Building with Rebecca Zornow. I'm Ken Humphrey. I think I know most of you that I see on here. I recognize some familiar names, so I hope everybody's having a good night. For the next hour and a half, Rebecca is going to take us through her workshop, again, titled Character Building. As a quick intro, Rebecca is a book coach specializing in science fiction and fantasy and enjoys meeting writers of all types. She's edited over 5 million words. And I want to repeat that 5 million words and coached over 800 writers motivated to wrangle and polish their work in progress. A writer herself, she understands how to strategize to a successful creative career. She's a member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association and, of course, a member of the WWA. She also was a guest on the WWA's Midwest Writers Room podcast back in September of 2025. You can find Rebecca at conquerbooks.com. I have just dropped that link in the chat. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Just as a few housekeeping notes before she does get started, feel free to pop your questions into the chat. If they're pertinent to the topic that she's speaking on at that point, I'll bring up the question then. Otherwise, she did reserve time at the end of this for a general question and answer period. But without further ado, Rebecca, take us away.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. And thank you to the Wisconsin Writers Association for having me tonight and all of you for joining me. We are going to be going deep into character building because I really believe that characters are the drivers of books. They're what bring us back to our favorite book series, our favorite novels, and what brings our readers back to our work as well. So we're going to be doing a few hands-on exercises and discussion questions. Make sure you have a paper and pen nearby or open up a Word document or another way to take some notes. And yeah, as Ken said, if you have questions, pop them in the chat along the way, and then we'll reserve some time at the end for some general questions. So jumping right into it, what's more engaging? A spaceship descends, pure black and foreign against the overcast sky. It's larger than most buildings in New York City, and the city block looks inverted as it comes to hover above a skyscraper. An eerie glow brightens on the underside of the alien ship, and the building beneath is swarmed with a rush of something citizens on the street can't identify. The glass of the windows crash outward, and the crowd runs. A single man is lifted out of a window and taken. So let's think through some of the markers we get here. We know we're in a city. We know there's an alien invasion. A lone man is identified. But there's not really much else to draw us in. We're not dealing with a character immediately besides that lone man, and we get the sense of a crowd. So compare that to this summary for a story. A university student's father is taken by aliens, and only she can get him back, except she doesn't like him very much. He actually told her not to attend college, and even though he has plenty of money, he didn't pay a dime towards tuition. And if our protagonist goes to rescue her dad, she will never be able to go back to school because in her society, once you're out, you're out. So our protagonist has to choose between saving a person who hasn't been there for her and fulfilling her dream. She chooses to save her father for moral reasons, but carries resentment along the way, and the moment of the big rescue is marked by a huge fight. The dad insists he didn't need rescuing. She's upset he's making this more difficult like he always does. The special ops team that accompanied our protagonist on the alien ship can't believe they're having a family spat in the middle of a huge shootout. So this isn't a written story, so if you feel inspired, feel free to write the dialogue between the student and her father. But this is just an idea of how we can think about what really pulls us into a story. You know, lots of times when we sit down to write, we think that we have to make it atmospheric, it has to be grand, the prose has to be there, and all of those things come through in layers. But at the heart of it, we really need characters who have a beef with someone else, like this student and her father, who have some resentment that they're carrying that's going to crop up at a key moment at the climax, who maybe has some space for humor or discussion to happen. And really part of the key is thinking about ourselves as part of the story. In this first example, like, well, maybe we can understand or brainstorm what we might do in a vague alien invasion. But there's nothing here really for us to say, oh, I wouldn't do this like that character did. I would do this instead. Or, gosh, she's really treating her father poorly. Or, hey, that father, why isn't he there for his daughter while she's going through college? Whereas this one, you can almost pick out like sentences that have weight to them. The sentences that make us think like, oh yeah, that's really something that would make me upset too. Or you can almost visualize the scene of them getting into a family spat when they're trying to be escaping this spaceship. And that's because good story is really driven by the characters who are building it. The kinds of characters that pop in your head and don't leave, who visit you on your walks or as you're getting, ready for the day, and they just keep yammering in your ear and you start to get to know them. And we're going to talk about how we get them put on the page. One of the things a lot of writers like to do these days is visit Pinterest for some different images of character ideas. I think that if you're a visual person, it can be helpful to build a compilation of images and post it by your desk when we're drafting and we have those little hiccup moments where it's like, oh, what am I going to write about? Like looking at those images, giving us some words for how their face looks, how their clothing looks, what sorts of things are around them. But really, we're thinking about developing characters and knowing them as we know real people in our lives. We're going to cover a few different methods, techniques you can use in your current work in progress. So you can think of a character that you're already working with, or you can come up with a character through the exercises tonight, someone as a practice, or you can keep in a bank for a short story later on. The goal is up to you, but I do hope you follow through with the exercises as we go. Hi, I'm science fiction and fantasy book coach Rebecca Zornow. I founded the book coaching firm Conquer Books. I specialize in science fiction and fantasy, all kinds of speculative fiction, which I think you can already tell from some of my story examples. But I love writers of all kinds, and I often lead workshops that are not genre specific, but focused on story and craft, which is what we're doing tonight. In my book coaching firm, I do a lot of one-on-one coaching, looking at manuscripts, helping writers flesh out the story idea that they have in their head, getting it down on the page, figuring out what do you do with it once you have a polished piece. And I'm also a writer myself. I've written 6 books. These are all my series starters at the bottom there. It's Over or It's Eden is an alien invasion story set in the Rocky Mountains. That's a standalone novel. Dangerous to Heal is a space opera duology, or a 2-book series, about a woman who has the ability to heal other people and the galactic corporation that wants to monetize that ability. And then Lansom Roads is about a reader who is obsessed with her favorite fantasy romance series to the point where she gets in trouble at work. So she flees to the library hoping to read anything besides this series that has just captured her brain for the last decade. And instead she meets her fairy book mother who agrees to send her inside the story to meet the handsome male lead if she solves a late series plot problem. And so for me, character is always what comes to me first when I'm thinking of a story. With Over It's Eden, I was standing in the shower during the pandemic, having those pandemic vibes, and I wondered what would happen if there was an alien invasion. And instead of, the Independence Day movie, hey, we won against the aliens, what if we lost? And I got this image of a soldier who, lost a war and then still has to find a way to go on. And I think probably for many of you, characters are the ones who come knocking. Sometimes it's a specific scene, sometimes it's a setting that we really want to write, or we are doing our historical or other research and we're starting to pull together ideas. And very quickly we want to get some characters hooked up with those thoughts so that they can be driving the ship of the story. So go ahead and drop in the chat. I'd like to know where you're from in the Midwest, what you're writing, either genre, if you write short stories and novels. Anytime there's this white pencil on the screen, that's going to be just a little exercise for you to do. You'll know when those slides come up, you're going to be doing something active during that time. If you have a specific question about the slide, as Ken mentioned, feel free to pop that in the chat. He's going to monitor that, or if it's really time sensitive, it's okay if you just pop in. But for any kinds of general questions, we're going to save those things at the end so we can talk a little bit more holistically about those bigger questions. Um, let's see who's here. So I'm up in Appleton. All right, we have Laura near Hudson, Wisconsin, science fiction and fantasy. Phoebe from Chicago. Dave, hi. Teresa Quinn's from Milwaukee, writing contemporary romance. Horror from Dave. Priscilla. Hi, Mary from Chicago. Okay, good. We've got a lot of different genres. Phoebe forgot speculative middle grade. Hello, Rebecca from Spooner. Okay, and Roger, also from Appleton. Hi, I think we emailed a short time ago. Okay, good. I like to get a sense of who's here, what you write. It looks like we have a really great wide variety. And perfect. Okay, yes, this is a flower sketch. Stay with me. So we want to design a characters that readers can really plug into, one that's going to keep the pages turning. And when we sit down to write, we often feel dissatisfied. We write something about the character, but it doesn't quite meet what's in our brain, or we come back to that scene a couple weeks later, and it makes us wonder where that fully fleshed character was that we thought of. And, you know, I like to think of art, visual art, when I'm thinking about how we're going to build a character. You know, this drawing of a flower doesn't have to be too good for us to get the sense that, yes, there's obviously a vase there, there's flowers, there's sunflowers, there's broadleaves. This isn't winning any awards, but we can look at it and say, like, that's a nice little flower sketch. Full disclosure, I was an English major, but I also took studio art in college. And this is a sketch from my 101 class. And this is the sketch we did next. It was a self-portrait. So probably an immediate reaction. The nose isn't quite right. The shading is a little odd on the hair. You know, we find ourselves being a lot more judgmental of portraits than we do of landscapes or flowers, things in the natural world, or, you know, seeing a still life of a fruit basket, you know, all these things. But when it comes to drawing people, we want it to be exact. We want it to be pristine. And that's because we spend our whole lives analyzing others' faces. We look for, you know, a slight quirk of the lip that tells us that they're not actually mad at us in an argument, or, you know, start to see a rise of like somebody's about to laugh at our joke. We become very good at those facial expressions, but also psychologically, right? We try and guess at what somebody else is thinking. We try and think of the motives of people in our lives that we know, as well as people that we will never meet in our lives, celebrities and public figures. We try and guess at their motives. And we really become experts on the people in and outside of our lives. And when we see something that's not quite there, it feels inordinately false to us. The flowers are flowers, but if the character isn't drawn right, written right, we really pick up at that. And that's what our readers are doing as they dive into our works. From the first page, we often have a sense of if we want to read a book or not. You hear that all the time about literary agents. You hear that all the time about publishing houses, and it always sounds so strict. But we do the same as readers when we go to the library or the bookstore, and we pick up a book to try out, and we read the first page, and we have an instant idea of whether or not we want to continue with that book. And I believe a big part of that drive or desire to keep reading has to do with character. It has to feel realistic. It has to feel like something we can see someone we can see ourselves spending time with. So we're going to leave behind, you know, Rebecca from Studio Art, and think about how we can do this for our own work. And just because it's hard doesn't mean it can't also be simple. Let's look at a couple examples of opening lines. This is from The Hunger Games. This is the first sentence. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. So we get a couple of tone elements right away. We get a couple of signals about the kind of book we're going to invest our time in. The other side of the bed is cold. That speaks of loneliness. It speaks of maybe a family or a couple or someone who's divided from another. It definitely isn't, when I wake up, I stretch luxuriously in my bed and I'm just ready for like a life of leisure. No, this is a character who is living a life of poverty and discomfort, and we're going to see more trouble coming her way. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. She's dissatisfied. That's something we can hang on to as a reader. Stephen King's The Gunslinger, which is his fantasy trilogy, the first sentence of book one reads, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." So even from that very first sentence, we have this dichotomy of two different characters. And if you were to have to guess, you might guess just based on symbolism, maybe the man in black fleeing is the individual who is either the villain or the bad guy. Maybe he is being pursued unfairly. We're not sure. And then the gunslinger followed. And it's not chased. It's not, he is panicked as he's running across the desert trying to get to this man in black. He's just following, which speaks to a measure of a slower cadence. There's more control there. And so we get these two individuals who are obviously not going to be on the same page, and that's a promise of conflict. And if there's one thing that we really like to read, it's conflict. We want to know how things are going to resolve. We want to know what problems are going to happen before those things resolved. So I am a genre-specific book coach, but this can apply to all kinds of fiction genres, whatever genre you are writing in. I wanted to think about how narrow subgenre can get. So if we think of fantasy, whether you're a fantasy reader or not, you can think of a couple of famous fantasies, things like The Lord of the Rings, that's high or epic fantasy, but there's also low fantasy, dark fantasy, fables and fairy tales. We often grow up, reading those fables and fairy tales, those kind of timeless stories. Romantasy is a new subgenre, which is fantasy romance. Superheroes fall into fantasy. Urban fantasy, taking place in modern times or in cities. Paranormal, maybe more on the monsters and myth front than elves and dwarves. Portal fantasy, time travel, historical fantasy fiction. So historical fiction, but with a fantasy element. And those are just a couple of examples. And we are always pushing into new subgenre territory. So I want you to take a moment. Think of, a lot of you posted in the chat what genre you typically write in, maybe what genre you're writing in right now, but either picking the genre of the book that you're currently working on, the short story you're currently working on, or picking a random subgenre to kind of explore things as we go tonight. And write that down on your paper. It's so interesting because I think as writers, we pare down genre so quickly, like science fiction. Look at all those names there. And when I talk to readers versus writers, a lot of readers know, yeah, I like a dystopian novel, but maybe they're not familiar with steampunk or space opera or galactic empire. And so sometimes these genre decisions are for ourselves, but they're also for our readers, even if they don't recognize the terminology that we're using. So if you've written down your subgenre, I want you to think about what genre you're working in, whether it's contemporary romance, whether it's humor, whether it's historical fiction or a speculative fiction element. And I want you to think about 5 different characteristics of your world, because I think it's really important before we get into the specifics on your character to think about what sort of platform are we working with here? What sort of world are they living in? There's tropes and archetypes that transcend genre, right? You can have the same character archetype appear. We see the hero in romance. We see the hero in high fantasy. We see the hero in political thrillers. But Oftentimes our character's psychology or the decisions or the problems that they come up against is specific to the world. And even if you're not working in a speculative fiction like science fiction and fantasy, there's still world building that we all do. If you're working in contemporary times, you're still thinking about, well, is it today? Was it 2020? Am I going to include the pandemic? Am I actually writing in 2027? Am I going to think about politics? Am I going to think about what's happening outside the US? Is it based outside of the US? There's all these questions about scope. And so thinking about the characteristics of your world also automatically help hone in on what kind of scope we're dealing with for our project. If I were to pick science fiction and one of the characteristics of my world is that, Earth is now starting to trade with other planets, that tells me a lot about the abilities and the scope of the journeys that characters in my book might be doing. All right, if you have 3 to 5, that's good to go off of. Even if we're dealing with something that's fantastical, or even if we're in love with our own world building and we're really excited to build out this research, or we're excited to build out this framework that we're telling the story in, we don't want to let that distract us too much from the heart of a story. When you think of what would make Frodo carry a horrible ring all the way to Mount Doom, there's a lot going on there. Characters don't just accidentally become heroes. They don't accidentally get into all of these problems. Well, maybe there's a little bit of accident there, but we like it when there's a rhyme and a reason putting them in that place, driving them forward. And all that comes down to your character wants something. Whether they know it or not at the beginning of the book, whether you know it or not at the beginning of your draft, your character is going to want something, and that's going to drive them through decisions that may not be easy. That's going to drive them through traumatic events. That's going to drive them through to happy things because they want something that's going to keep them going. And so when you think about what that character wants, and we're speaking abstractly a little bit, yeah, we know kind of what world our character is going to be in, but we may not know what that character is yet. But we think about what in the plot stands in their way, and how do they, with all of their flaws, all of their, messy human or elven or futuristic things, stand in their own way. Because we all know that feeling of having a dream and then maybe making choices that go directly opposite to what we said that we wanted. Or we all know how outside events can stack up, making it harder to get to the thing that we want. And that's the things that we know that we want. Our character wants something, they may or may not be aware of it at the time, but one thing they are going to need to do is they are going to need to go on a journey. They're going to need to change to get to that thing. And that's really what we're looking for by the end of the book. So at the beginning of the book, your character wants something, whether they know it or not. They are going to have problems inspired by themselves, inspired by the plot. And then by the end of the book, perhaps they will get that thing. Perhaps they will change and say, actually, I don't need to own, my own cafe because I'm fulfilled doing this XYZ career. Or they're going to change and they're going to make a decision about what they actually needed and find fulfillment in that way. Or we might see a rare case where they get exactly what they were hoping to get. So we're going to practice how we can think about building a character together and find out what it is that that character wants. I do like character sheets that give us a few basics and then delve into psychology. I think that when it comes to building a story Bible, when it comes to building character sheets that are the endless, one time in 5th grade, they took a field trip to Madison to see the Capitol building. And that's a Wisconsin joke because we all know that should be in 4th grade. Or, one time when they were a kid, they had this pet. And those things aren't always necessary to the project that you're working on. If it comes up, that's great. if it does the building for us. But sometimes character sheets can also be a way to procrastinate a little bit as we're trying to get inspired. So I think giving yourself a really limited scope when it comes to doing some building with your character sheets is the way to go. So Lisa Kron wrote a really great book titled Story Genius. And if you haven't read it yet, I would put it on your TBR because it is all about the psychology of a reader as they're going through a story. And in that book, she talks a lot about how, you know, in very early times for humans, we told stories as ways to survive. Like, hey, there were blackberries over there by that cliff, or oh gosh, that's always like the forest that has the tiger in it. Maybe we won't go there. There is a necessity to communicate that keeps us safe, that keeps us healthy and happy. And she talks about how we're wired to want to hear then those stories because it helps us survive, or in the sense of a book, it helps us see how other people live, how other characters live. It helps us deal with big thoughts and big experiences we have, that the book provides a different kind of format for thinking those things through, for finding gratification, seeing, after 8 epic books, finally the main character gets together with that guy that she's been wanting this whole time. And remembering from our disturbing self-portrait from earlier, how a false character feels broken. So when we do these character sheets, we want to be thoughtful about how we're building and try and think really strategically and logically about how to stack each thing going forward. Can I have 3 volunteers who are comfortable turning their mics on and then are just going to kind of rotate through a few questions with me? And if you're willing, just turn your mic on and say, hey. All right, we have somebody here, but it seems like maybe there's a little feedback. Okay, we have David, we have Carrie, and we have Roger. Does somebody have their TV on, perhaps? Or a radio? Okay, there we go. All right, Carrie, Roger, you're with me. If somebody, and there we go. If anybody else wants to pop on as a third, that would be great. I'm going to exit here and we're just going to look at my slides in PowerPoint so that we can type on them. So let's see, Carrie, Roger, Carrie, why don't you go first? What subgenre are we going to work with?
How about is there a sci-fi romance?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could do that.
Let's see, there was a joke recently that science fiction romance is going to be called science friction.
Oh, I love that.
All right, so sci-fi romance. Roger, if you're thinking of a futuristic world, tell me some things that you might think about that might happen, technology they might have, any kinds of characteristics.
Futuristic. I don't look to the future that far. When you get to be my age, the future is too close. As a futuristic world, I would, I've kind of, most of my writing is in contemporary, what's going on now, and so I don't really do that much of that.
Okay, I'll switch with you if you want. If you want to think up a name, I'll type out a few characteristics of the world. So sci-fi romance, we're going to do near future, which is something that happens in the next, 30 years or so. There's going to be a major focus on the downfall of the internet. And we are going to be building on the moon. So that just gives us a couple pieces of framework for what we're dealing with here. Okay, Roger, do you have a name?
I'm sorry.
Roger, do you have a name for a character?
Lenny.
Lenny. Okay, Carrie, you get to decide the name.
35.
Or Carrie, you get to decide the age.
Okay.
Oh, the age. Okay. I love kind of a the white-haired dudes. So let's go with the 70 something.
Nice. And I'm going to decide that Lenny is a female, and we're going to change that spelling to IE.
Okay.
Roger, we're back to you. And this might feel a little tricky because you don't do, writing beyond contemporary times, but thinking about what we know about this world. Well, there's a downfall of the internet. Maybe we're using different technology. Maybe that's causing lots of problem. We're doing maybe bases on the moon. What kind of job do you think Lenny might have?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement.
Oh, it's a good one.
Good. And then I think Lenny is going to be an expert. Lenny is 70 years old. She has seen it all. She has also recently delved into new technologies. And, at this stage, we don't really need to know what those technologies are. We can always make up a name for things later and figure them out. But I'm thinking about Lenny as somebody who is, man, things are changing in the world. She's always been an expert, but now suddenly she has to learn some new skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
Carrie, who do you think Lenny's closest relationship might be?
I would say her artificial intelligence housemate.
Okay, I like that. Roger, a couple of words to describe Lenny.
Aggressive, yet has a certain romance. She's romantic, right?
Okay, I like that. Like Lenny's got a little bit of a softie in her, but she doesn't let anybody see.
Yeah.
Greatest fears. I think that, for any sort of law enforcement detective, it's not being able to save everyone. That definitely introduces a lot of ideas of tension, but really greatest fears could be anything. It could be something that's really tied to the plot of the story. It could be something that crops up on the sidelines. But so Lenny is living in the world. She's 70 years old, and we want to think a bit more about how she sees herself. And before we go forward, I should have mentioned, if you want to take screenshots of any of these, that's fine, but I'll have these questions up at the end. And then I'm also going to give you a guide at the end of the session, and they'll have the questions here as well. So, Carrie, we know a little bit about Lenny, but tell me more about how she views herself.
Well, right away, I already was getting an idea. I don't remember what year you said this was. Was this 2000 near future or more like 20s and 30s?
Maybe like,
I mean,
let's
ahead.
say 35
I'm
years from
thinking
now.
Okay, great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great because that goes along with the idea I had. Well,
Okay.
I think that Lenny, because it's so far, it's further into the future, technology with the advent of AI started to everything is just reaching a crescendo it's jet propelled, the speed of all of the advancements in technology, and that includes medical science, and so that means she at 70 years old, she's actually considered what used to be considered late life. She's actually considered like just getting started. Like she's going to live to be 200 or something like that. So immediately it turns it on its head. The reader is like, what? I like doing that.
Okay.
So
I like that too.
And what was your question? I was going to tie it into what you said.
More about how she views herself.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So she views herself as, in reality, in that time, she views herself as basically, sorry for the cussing, but she feels like a badass. She can conquer anybody, anything. She's still in excellent physical shape. Her mind is sharp, and she's tough. She's tough. She doesn't take any prisoners. So that's the way she views herself, as basically she could do anything. But the little nick in her armor is that she's still unfulfilled romantically.
Yeah, I like that. And that ties back to that word that Roger put forward, that she's aggressive. Like she's really
Right,
confident, she's going for
right.
it.
Yeah.
Roger, what do you think this Lenny person, what did she love about her childhood? And her
Uh,
childhood might be, she might have been born in like 2000.
okay. She grew up on a farm. She loved to hunt and fish. Her dad um, took her with him all the time because she didn't have any brothers. So she was the she filled in as a son.
But and then I'm gonna do what did she hate about her childhood? And I think that it's gone.
Mm.
She's seeing like young people don't have the same experience as she did, and that's at once nostalgic, but then also kind of heartbreaking for her. So Lenny is well on her way. Carrie, Roger, thank you. You guys can go back on mute. We're gonna end this here, and just kind of call out so we can also think about what's likable about Lenny. Is she intuitive or realistic? Any spiritual beliefs, political beliefs? That's all kind of telling us about, well, who is Lenny outside of the story, right? We had our first slide that just gave us kind of the fact sheet of what's going on with Lenny. What are we even going to call this character? And then we had her inner workings, like who is Lenny from the day to day? And then this next sheet is on story development. So thinking not just of Lenny, the woman who's living in the future, works in law enforcement. Now we're thinking about Lenny, the story, Lenny, the character. So some questions of what's wrong in Lenny's life. I think we are already getting some inkling, some tension about where she is in time and space, what she grew up doing versus what she's seeing. This idea of like maybe technology is changing and she's trying to keep up and she feels like she's, mid-career, but maybe tech-wise she's lagging a bit. What concrete desires does Lenny have? Carrie mentioned that she's looking for love still. She's kind of like hiding that part of herself. But then also abstract desires. What does your character need that they're not aware of? How will your character change through the story? So if we think about where Lenny's starting point is, we want to see demonstrated growth throughout the book. And if Lenny's going to be a series, if Lenny is going to be a standalone and, maybe she didn't grow all that much, but she had a different realization or, we want some thread that we can spin through there. And by the end of it, look back and like see, okay, that was some good progress that we had there. And then what belief does Lenny hold on to with a death grip that will be overturned by the end? I think that's always a great question to ask because we're all filled with things that we believe that aren't really true, stories that we tell ourselves, those misbeliefs that can get us in trouble as we go through the plot or life, and thinking about, well, what is Lenny going to refuse to believe when her younger law enforcement officers tell her like, no, Lenny, this is the way things are these days, or her superiors tell her, no, Lenny, this is the way life is and always has been. Like, what is she really going to hold on to that's going to be a thorn in her side as she tries to resist it? What will they need to go through to overcome these faulty beliefs? We love to see characters not just with the misbelief but have to confront it. And then how will your character prove they've changed? So thinking again about the end of the story, thinking about what is going to happen to propel them forward. So I have all the questions here. We're going to go on a quick break. We might do a little less than 5 minutes. I'm going to start a timer. So just take a little bit of time, jot some notes on this character that you thought up, and then we'll reconvene and we'll go forward into the next part of this process. All right, and we're going to come back. The timer's still going, but I think it paused while I was poking around in the chat. So feel free to take a screenshot, or I have that guide at the end that you can download that has all of the questionnaire. So this gives us a scaffold for working forward where we can see really quickly that even just a couple of identifiers for a character can start to build that tension when we're looking for it. That does so much more than just thinking of individual experiences in somebody's life, but really using the pieces of that character's life to then draw us into the plot and find the things that are going to build tension and obstacles as the character goes along. Another obstacle that comes forth is the antagonist, whether they're a bad guy, villain, or not. The antagonist doesn't have to be this super villain out in spandex trying to blow up buildings. They might be somebody at work, a coworker. They might be a family member, depending on the genre that you're writing in. It could be a neighbor who is always just a little too nosy and is going to upset the plans of, what our protagonist has been hiding all along. So they just have to be somebody who is there to antagonize our hero. Oftentimes, these individuals want the same thing. And so maybe there's some sort of competition or outright race to get it. But then sometimes it's just they're not mortal enemies. They have differing values, differing beliefs, differing ways of dealing with things. So even if they have the same end goal, they're going about different ways of trying to get there. And so we want to see if you do have an antagonist in your novel or your short story, we want to see them appearing often throughout the book. And this is another way to spur discussion with your protagonist, another way to think about the growth that they're facing, another way to think about how they'll come up with challenges and get over them. It really gives us a push-pull effect as we see our character, jealous of the antagonist or responding in different ways. And the antagonist should feel like a well-rounded character in their own right. Oftentimes we love the villain just as much as we love the hero, but really their role in the book would go away without the protagonist. Their role is to deepen our understanding of the character who drove us to write that book in the first place. So we're going to do another writing exercise. And before we get into that, I just want you to kind of think about these questions. And they're good questions to ask about any project that you're working on, not just your current one, going back to stories and asking, did I flesh these things out well, or in future stories, but, thinking about who was your character before the story began. Like with real people, they should have a past, deep-rooted desires, beliefs that won't be easily changed. What is the situation that starts them on that journey? So we often have an idea of the things that we want to have happen in a book. We want to think about, that catalyst event or the instigating event that really pushes them forward. And oftentimes there is a reason that this specific character is going on a journey. I'm reading a book right now that involves an experience that impacts everyone on Earth. It's a science fiction book. And it's really interesting to think about, well, of all the individuals who the story could focus on, like, what about this character is interesting enough that we should follow this character versus another character? Or if you're dealing with high fantasy, why is it that we need to follow, this queen versus the handmaid, or this, cook in the scullery versus this knight? Like, why is this character the one with the most interesting story? And thinking about how the problems in the book will impact all the characters, but it'll impact your main character in a different way. Their stakes should feel different. So we're going to do something that I like to do with all of my clients before we start developing a book, and that's boiling our story down to 3 sentences. So for me, the 3 sentences is a summary, but it's also a little roadmap for how we're going. So in sentence 1, you introduce your character, tell us who they are. Well, Lenny is a 70-year-old woman who has recently had to take a case on a new moon base and try and solve a crime, something like that. You're talking about who they are and what situation they found themselves in. I have another example on the right here, a fantasy story. So sentence 1 would look like this. A retired teacher, Maud goes back to school for herbalism, only to learn she's out of her league as modern universities rely on magic. So that tells us who she is and a little bit of the problem that she's having. Sentence 2. Tell us how the inciting incidents turns into the main plot problem. We don't want to just know, okay, this is a character in an interesting situation. We want to know what's going wrong for that character. And then tell us what the stakes are. Maud finds out magic is only possible by the enslavement of an ancient priestess, and because of her grandmother's stories, she knows this is dangerous and decides she must free the priestess. So it's not enough of a story for Maud just to go back to school to learn to be an herbalist, find use for her magic. She's going to get to the school and find a big problem that's going to impact her and everyone else at the school. So sentence 3, thinking about how then it elevates us even further to the entire story. Tell us what's at stake and tell us what Maud is going to lose if she fails, or what the consequence is if she can't figure this out on her own. Sentence 3. Inexperienced and underestimated, Maud must tap into the magic that powers the school in order to go up against the matrons and protect the students from the same wrath that has haunted her family for generations. So we know way at the top that Maud is going back to school, and then by the end of it, she's solving like a family generations long crisis. That really shows us how we can scaffold these things and really amp up the stakes, really make it something where it's not just, oh, that's a good story concept, but we go like, oh my goodness, I need to know what happens next with Maud. I'm on chapter 18 and like the matrons have just found her. Like that sort of tension needs to be ongoing with your character's journey throughout the book. The guide will also have a little write-up about these 3 sentences. So if you're not finished, you can always work on it later. So I want to take a little bit of time to look at character interiority. I think that it's really important to get a good focus on who your character is before you start writing or very early in the process. But we're going to think about what sorts of techniques we can use in the drafting and editing phases. And just taking a gander at that artwork there, that's actually my new book. So this book is coming out in September, and I couldn't resist just throwing some character art in there. So let's look at an example, thinking of interiority. And thank you to Luella. I used her name in this. The castle was set upon the hill. Luella approached on horseback, and the dirt road snaked up the hillside. She was nervous about arriving at dusk. It seemed rude. The castle itself was narrow and tall to fit the foundation on the hilltop. The upper floors had likely been added in layers over time, perhaps as the family money grew. The blocks of the castle all over it were dull gray, but the windows shimmered with real glass. 4 spires stood on each corner of the castle. So that sets a little scene. We know there's a woman on horseback. We know that, she's a little bit nervous about arriving. And there's this castle there. That's good. I like reading fantasy. I would probably read on this, but it also might be maybe after that chapter, I would set the book aside. Let's think about this comparison. Luella's horse moved eagerly beneath her, as if the tired beast could sense the stable close by, even despite the harsh incline of the road as it snaked up the hillside. Arriving as an unexpected guest at sunset was not ideal. Luella scanned the castle for any clue about the noble family that lived there. To most, a castle was a castle, but Luella had endured more than one lecture from her architecture-obsessed aunt and couldn't help but take in the pointed turrets, the revival architecture of the battlements. The castle was gray save the windows. Those twinkled in the sunset. Good. If they had money for real glass, they would hopefully have enough provisions to host a stranger for the night. So when we think about character interiority, we think about all of the things that come through and what our character is experiencing on the page, what colors their worldview, what sorts of things they'll notice. If all of you came to my house and we all gathered here in this room, you would all notice different things. If you love plants, you might look at the different plants. If you are looking for a good book to read, you might start perusing the shelves. If you're a little bit shy, you might, think like, gosh, what am I doing at this weird lady Rebecca's house? All these different things, we would have different interpretations. And that's why we need to see a different interpretation in the interiority of our character in the scenes. It's not enough to have a good sense of what the setting looks like and see the forward motion on the page of character going from point A to point B. We want to know how they're interpreting it. What sorts of things annoys them, or what sorts of things are they experienced enough to pick up on? If we think of Lenny in a scene, if she is casually, going through the grocery store getting her groceries, that's going to be a lot different than I was, because she has the eyes to look for petty crime, or to be thinking about, different cases, and thinking about how to put that together. Like, people can be in the same room, people can be in the same story, but they're going to be interpreting events in different ways. And it's our job as writers to, without info dumping or without being too heavy-handed, try and layer those pieces in so that we have an ongoing rising understanding of how our character works, even outside of the big pieces of, the plot that they're trying to wrangle or the climax that's coming. We want to know, like, the day-to-day things and take it slow. I think we often speed through our scenes and try and get all the things done, but our character needs time to process, and it's highly rewarding for readers to see that processing on the page. Here's another example, and in your head, kind of add up the character interiority pieces that you see. The dwarf planet hung effortlessly in a void of gray and black, hovering on the edge of what was properly considered the solar system. Alone in darkness since it was formed, the planet was void of life until a tiny prick of light arrived, a spacecraft. The backdrop was glorious. A trail of dirty ice and rock closer to the sun sparkled. Further still, distant heavenly bodies marked the dark curtain. It was so glorious, in fact, that Continue Research planned to feature the panoramic vista in holographic recruitment ads. It was all there. One just had to reach out and take it. So there's not a lot here in terms of giving us an opening that helps us understand what characters we're dealing with. We get a reference to maybe a research company. We know that there's a spacecraft, and we assume somebody or some robot is piloting it, but there's really nothing to, nobody's taking us by the hand and leading us into a story. So in this example, the moment he smiled, Lasse knew it was to ease the blow. It was a kind, understanding smile, the type reserved for children, not citizens of Dandelion Station. Lasse alias, your application to create a mural in the Delta wing of Dandelion Station has been denied, committee member Crux Ion said. Though the committee found entertainment in your design, ultimately the project is not innovative enough to merit grant approval. Ion smiled again. Lasse carefully avoided smiling back. So we really could amp it up here as well, but we have a few more indicators than the previous example. There's a lot of smiling going on, and Lasse is kind of cataloging, well, what's a good smile and what's a smile out of pity? And, when somebody smiles at you, do you smile back? So those are all the kind of minute decisions that we make all day long in our lives. And they're the kind of minute decisions we want to see your character making constantly through the manuscript. And that's why it's so important to pick scenes that have a lot of weight in them, because we want to explore them in depth and balance both the big plot things with these small detail things. So at this point, you can take a few notes on how you might show your character's interiority for your protagonists. How do they present when they walk into a room? What sorts of things do they often think about? What habits or tics do they have? What annoys them? What gets them engaged or excited? What is the lens that they're using to interpret what's in front of them? Some things we want to be mindful of is being very detail orientated. Avoid info dumping, which is where we have, paragraphs that are giving us the backstory or all of the reasoning behind why it was, this character just couldn't stand chai lattes because she had a bad experience once. And, we just need to know oh, she's in a cafe, she smelled a chai latte and ugh, kind of gave her the ick. And then really ground us in scene, making sure our character is interacting with the environment, making sure that they are rapidly making assessments. If they walk into a room, well, who do they go sit by? You know, all those little tiny decisions all add up to a bigger picture. They're evidence of how our character is making their decision making. And at its best, interiority really should feel unique to your character. If you were to take some of it and plop it into another character's point of view chapter or another book, it should feel odd. It should be so unique to that character's world perspective that it feels engaging. And then if you're still kind of thinking about, man, all this character stuff, like what's the big takeaways? And it's really that you're trying to put your character into uncomfortable situations, conversations with people they're at odds at, interesting situations where you can see them at work, see them, you know, struggle or flourish, and give us some kind of data or samples of how they respond. If you get hung up in the middles of stories, you know, think about the middle of the book being a moment to take your character to a low and making them confront how much they don't know or what they're worried about in association with the plot. If as you draft, you find that you get overly worried about like, how is this all going to go together? You know, I'm trying to make sure that this character has like this proper arc. I recommend outlining before you start drafting, and then just draft forward without going back and editing and tinkering on those things and fixating on them. You know, get to the end of the story and trust that you're going to be the developmental editor that your story needs. You're going to put in the editing work. And if you still just have worries generally about characters or drafting or books and writing, you're worried whether it's interesting, we always hear show, don't tell. I'm going to add definitely don't summarize. We want to see the real decisions. We want to see the real things that our characters are going through. And if you find yourself summarizing rather than experiencing, it's not going to feel genuine to the reader. So Ken is going to put in the chat, if he hasn't already, a link to a Google Drive folder. I have a workbook called Building a Story, and it has the first 30 pages there for you, which has the exercises we did tonight, and then also a few things around building a schedule for writing, thinking about character a little bit more in depth with some other exercises, and other notes on like foundational things that you can use at the start of a new project. And so you can use that anytime for any story. And then just a call out, in addition to conquerbooks.com, I'm also on Substack. That's how I put out my newsletter. You can see on the top left side, that's the homepage. So all of the posts that I do, the essays on writing and publishing show up there. And I'm doing a book in a year challenge, which is kind of breaking down, okay, in January, if you want to write a book in a year, what sorts of tasks should you be working on? Okay, by February, what's your word count? You know, breaking it down so that by the end of the year, you have a polished manuscript. But you can join that anytime because you get access to all of the articles, and January can just as easily be April. I do an essay series called Live Edits where I take 500 words from an opening of a subscriber story, and I kind of do either a line edit or developmental edit and just take some notes on what sorts of things pop out to me as an editor. And then I pulled this up because I was interested to see, this is the most popular post, how to fix info dumps. So a big range of things. Okay, and then there's my website, there's my email. If you want to send me an email, if you have a follow-up question, or you just want to be able to tell somebody, hey, Rebecca, I wrote a story and like the character, you know, went off the wires. What am I doing here? You know, feel free to send me a line anytime. And I think we have some time for some Q&A about characters or other writing things.
So, Rebecca, I put this in the chat, but one of the things that drives me nuts when I read books is when a new character gets introduced and then immediately there's either a paragraph, several paragraphs, maybe even a page or two of just info dumping their background. Like David walks in the room. David had graduated from college when he was 28, and it just, to me, it just completely stops all momentum. And depending on how egregious it is, those are things that actually cause me to put down a book. And so it really resonated with me when you kind of said no info dumps, right? Weave, if the history is important, you weave it amongst the following pages, not just stop the plot to tell us all about this character. You can just kind of sprinkle in
Mhm.
that history as they go along.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to write an essay about your character where you can just neatly kind of tie everything up. But I don't, yeah, walk into a room and start telling me everybody, well, one time when I went to the library with my mom and I checked out all these books and then I held up the big receipt and that changed my life forever. And then I sit down and I'm like, and how are you doing? Like those things are often things that should come in little teeny tiny pieces. And when you think about your character's interiority, you think about the character like, well, what are they thinking about right now? That gives you, the writer, an excuse to narrate or write about those things, use exposition judiciously. And if I'm moving through like the farm market and I'm thinking about, oh, Tessa, that, great villain of mine. I'm, fuming about her. No, I'm thinking about, okay, here's the carrots that I need for this event. And oh yeah, oh, Tessa, she still has my cutting board. Like you're looking for details in the setting, details in the plot or the story that gives you an excuse to bring those things out in a much more natural way.
Yep, because that's generally how we learn about people in real life when we introduce somebody. They'll kind of summarize quickly, oh yeah, I do this for a job and I'm from this town, right? And then as you continue talking to them, getting to know them, then all the other elements just come into play. They'll drop little clues here and there. They'll say stuff. It'll make you ask the questions like, oh, when did you move to that town, right? And so trying to mirror that when you introduce a character, I think is probably one of the more effective ways to keep readers engaged and not just stop your forward momentum on the plot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you're building a case file bit by bit. I'm also curious if nobody has a direct question, just, what feels hard about writing characters or drafting characters?
I have one. So in my first book, I know I had too many characters, and it was kind of like almost like a movie. You could see all the rooms they went into. You just kind of see it through going back. And so in the second book, I took most of that out, and now I don't have enough description or dialogue, and I'm trying to figure out what's the good balance.
Okay, so you wrote book one, you had a lot of that description, and then in book two, you've left some of that out. Is that right?
The first book I wrote, when I went through it with people, I had way too many characters. Like I knew my characters, but it was way too many for someone who didn't. And I also had a lot of description, good description, but
Mhm.
I felt it was maybe too much for a book compared to maybe a movie script or something. So in this book, I consciously didn't. I added very little. I thought I can always go back and add more dialogue. Now my dialogue is way too low, and I don't do a lot of scenes, and I'm wondering how much to add in without it being too much.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it sounds like your kind of editor intuition is telling you that you do want to see more, because it is coming to mind. And I always think that as writers, we want to trust that intuition that's kind of knocking and saying, like, is this like where we want it to be? And I think, especially in thinking about a second book, even if somebody read that first book, even if they loved it, like there's a good chance that they set it on their bookshelf and then maybe it was 6 months before they picked up the second book. Or for those of us who are writing series and like still in production, thinking about like, well, I put, book one out in 2021 and I'm still working on book two. Like it could be a while since somebody read that book and they do need those reminders. So it feels really close to you. But for the reader, they're going to feel appreciative of like, oh yeah, they did have that zany cat. And when it comes to things like physical description for characters, I remember reading actually the Babysitters Club series when I was in fifth grade and thinking about how, yep, you get the new one And on page 2, it just lists the entire like family history of the entire characters. Like we don't need something quite so heavy-handed as that, but we do want like those indicators. And I think it's more of a dated way to see long blocks of character description, like, oh, her hair was, just barely fluffy and she wore a blue sweater and things were growing dark outside the window. If you kind of bundle it together, it can feel a little dated if we have a paragraph that's just physical description.
Yeah,
The
and
other
this
thing,
isn't
okay.
physical description. I mean, I think I have a good balance there. It's more when they move from a scene to a scene, they go into another building, how much detail. I've put in the very basic, like if it's something having to show their character, maybe they pick certain colors or they had a certain style and it tells you about their character. I put it in, but that's all I put in, and now it's just not enough.
Okay. One thing you can do is you can look at an individual scene and even just underline all of those details and don't read the rest of the scene. Just look at the markers that you've underlined, kind of like when we did that adding up character interiority slide. Like look at like, hey, actually, I only mentioned 3 details about the setting. This isn't enough. Or you can say like, oh, actually, I'm really pleased with how I built this in and it's turning out. Another thing you can do is you can do an editing pass just on a specific topic. Sometimes we edit like all the way through the book. Sometimes you do an editing pass on just a side character. And you say, okay, I'm going to look just on this side character or this setting location or whatever topic you want and only look at that topic throughout the book. You can do a search and find for like the person's name or the setting name and look at what you said about that character when we first met. And then when we see them the second time, do we get any reminders? Is there more to add? And just take a really like kind of high bird's eye view look of it and look really carefully about, okay, through the whole book, I only mentioned her hair once. I probably should add, the wind blowing it around or add some other things. Or for a setting, I did a good job and I feel satisfied with it, but setting B, I think needs some work. So I would recommend that, both doing a character pass or just taking a scene and like underlining for the setting, like, okay, what do I physically mention here about the physicality of the space? Does that feel like enough to me?
Thanks. Yeah, that will be helpful.
Yeah.
Dave Rank has a good question about how can you use dialogue to show us a character?
Yeah, I think vernacular is a big thing. Thinking about what sorts of regional speech a character might use, what sorts of word choice might indicate their upbringing. That can be tricky when you're working with speculative fiction and you're kind of jumping into the future. I don't know the slang of that time when I start reading a book. So it's kind of like you're going to teach me through the dialogue. Um, it also indicates a lot about temperament. If a character is really long-winded, if they're really gruff, I think with dialogue, it can be highly, highly effective, but I think it works best when it's paired with a good amount of that character interiority. Because if I am in on a page and I'm reading like a conversation between 2 people, I kind of want to know, oh, did that character also notice that this character is throwing shade, or do they not, see the dynamic the same way because like this is just a saint, an overly patient person, and I'm, a little bit more prickly. And so some call outs to help us interpret what we're reading in that conversation can be helpful. I think that the dialogue is a really good way to show personality, but we still need a guide to hold our hand through the conversation and teach us a bit about like, validate us, I guess, in terms of, yeah, this is how we should be reading the situation.
Very nice. So I have a question. When it comes to a first person POV versus a third person, do you find authors maybe have an easier time describing their characters or getting us into the characters' heads when it is first person versus third, or is it just kind of the same either way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first person, it's easier to be voicey because we're using that character as a lens that if they're really sarcastic, we can pick that up even from page one with how they're describing things, how they're thinking about things. I think third person, it's trickier to get that voicey quality, but we have the hand holding of our narrator, can give us some bits and pieces and feed us directly but we don't want to be doing too much telling in those situations. We also want to feel like we're discovering it alongside. Um, it's interesting. I feel like both are really evenly done still in science fiction and fantasy. But it does seem like first person is really continuing to rise, like a lot of contemporary fiction that's coming out, especially in romance, like getting a first person point of view from like both the female and the male, or whatever the dual protagonists are, like getting both of their takes on it, I think is really engaging and fun for readers.
All right. Anybody else got any other questions?
Yeah, or anything about drafting, editing, any publishing things you want to chat through, any manuscript things you want to complain about.
If you ask us to complain about manuscripts, we'd be here all night.
Good. Well, this was great. I think that I liked the character that we started building with Lenny, and I always like doing that exercise, like kind of live building a character process to see how we can take tiny threads and start to spool them out. And then I do hope you all go to that link and download that guide. I think that, getting a really good standing foundation before you go ahead into drafting can help you save a lot of heartache when it comes time to make sure the draft feels good, feels like a book that you would hope that a reader would fall in love with.
Absolutely. So I want to thank Rebecca for coming on tonight, giving us, some time and some wisdom in terms of character building. I don't know about everybody else, but I've already downloaded that workbook and I kind of paged through it while she was talking. So definitely a lot of resources there. Follow those links. This session is recorded, so I will be sending out the video for this probably the next day or two if anybody wants to do a rewind on it. Other than that, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Rebecca, for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Thank you, WWA, and thank you all.
All right. Have a good night.